This is the grade 12, November 2016, paper 1. We are looking at the electrostatic question as well as a question on Ohm's law, both of which are suitable for grade 11 and grade 12 learners. If we look at the first question, 1.7, two charges, positive Q and negative Q, are placed a distance d from a negative charge Q. The charges Q and minus Q are located along lines that are perpendicular to each other, as shown in the diagram below. Which one of the following arrows correctly shows the direction of the net force on negative Q, due to the presence of charges plus Q and minus Q? Okay, so the way to answer this question, we need to find the net force. That means there is going to be a force that the positive Q exerts on Q, as well as the force that negative Q exerts. And we need to find the vector sum of these two forces. We can see from the diagram, and they've also told us that they are perpendicular to each other. When we see that the charges are perpendicular to each other, we would need to draw a tail-to-head vector diagram, and this is what's going to help us get the resultant. So if I look at these two charges, we can see that they are unlike and they will attract each other. So this charge here is going to attract negative Q, and we're going to get an upward force, and this is the force that positive Q exerts on the charge. And if I look at the second charge, if we look at these two charges now, we can see that they are both negative, so there is going to be a force of repulsion between them. I can now draw this repulsive force into my tail-to-head diagram. We know that when we have a tail-to-head diagram, we always begin at the head of the first vector. And now I would draw the repulsive force that negative Q exerts. And that is my two vectors. To get the resultant now, we would draw a straight line from the start to the end where it meets head to head, and that would be the resultant. If we look at our options A to D, we can now see that C is closest to the direction of R, and that would make C the correct answer. I've now got question 1.8 from the same examination, the November 2016 grade 12 paper 1, and this is a question on Ohm's law. The learners investigate the relationship between current I and potential difference V at a constant temperature, and this is the Ohm's law experiment. Three different resistors X, Y, and Z, and they obtain the graph shown below. The resistances of X, Y, and Z are Rx, Ry, and Rz respectively. Which one of the following conclusions regarding the resistances of the resistors is correct? And they now ask us to compare the resistances to see which ones are equal or which ones are greater than the other. Now, going back to our Ohm's law experiment, we know that when we did this experiment in grade 11, and we had to plot a graph of potential difference in volts versus current in amperes, we would get a straight line through the origin. And we could see that if I look at the gradient of this graph, then the gradient of this graph is equal to the change in V over the change in I. And we know from the Ohm's law equation, R equals V over I, that the gradient of this graph, V over I, would give us resistance. But if we look at the graph that they gave us, going back to the question, we can see that they have given us a graph of I on the y-axis and V on the x-axis. So now if I've got to work out the gradient of this graph, if I would say gradient is equal to change in I over change in V, and this would be 1 over R. So this time, the gradient represents 1 over resistance, the inverse of resistance. So this would tell us that gradient is the inverse of resistance. So the steeper the gradient, or the steeper the slope, the lower the resistance in this case. So if I take this back to the graph that they've given us, we can see that x has the steepest gradient. And by x having the steepest gradient, that would mean it has the lowest resistance. Whereas z has the lowest gradient, and therefore it would have the highest resistance. So if we want to order the resistance, we can see that z would have the greatest resistance, then y, and then x. So if we look at our options, A, B, C, D, option A would be the most correct. The resistance of Z is greater than the resistance of Y. Yes, we can see that. And Y has a greater resistance than X. So A is the correct answer.